As he sped back from Schönbrunn to Fontainebleau in the last week of October 1809, Napoleon realized that the moment he had long dreaded was at hand. He would have to divorce Josephine. Marie Walewska's pregnancy changed everything. But her reward for proving that the emperor could indeed sire children was to be cast into obscurity. She returned to Poland to her complacent husband Count Walewski, and when her son Alexander was born in 1810 he took the count's name. Napoleon was never so duplicitous as when reacting to the pregnancy. The infant of Wagram will one day be king of Poland, he announced bombastically, even as he wrote to Tsar Alexander to allow him a free hand in Marie's country, in return for the marriage he confidently expected with Alexander's sister, the Grand Duchess Anne. It was a characteristic of Napoleon's never to accept full responsibility for drastic action, whether it was d'Enghien's murder or the Pope's incarceration. He therefore allowed the record of his official correspondence to evince continuing devotion to Josephine while his actions argued otherwise. He wrongfooted her by summoning her to Fontainebleau when he knew he would be there before her, so that he could react with cold surprise when she arrived there on the evening of the 26th of October. Next, Josephine discovered that the door between her apartment and the emperor's had been sealed up. For 3 weeks she never managed to get a minute alone with him, for he insisted on inviting members of his family to all his meals. Every evening the vindictive Pauline held parties for her brother and threw Italian beauties at him, while pointedly not inviting Josephine, projecting the guilt he felt about the intended divorce onto her, and therefore holding her in some sense to blame for the awkward position he was in. He declined to tell her what was on his mind but reacted to her presence with cold rage. He spent all his spare time hunting, an activity Josephine was known to detest, and visited his murderous fantasies on the dumb beasts. On one occasion he and his fellow Nimrods slaughtered 80 wild boar in a Roman-style arena, seemingly unable to bear the emotion that would surely follow once he told Josephine his decision. Napoleon at first tried to get his intimates to break the unwelcome news to her. He tried to enlist Hortense, then Eugene, even Cambacérès, but all declined the task. He finally broke the logjam by moving back to Paris, and then brusquely announcing his decision to divorce after dinner on the 30th of November. The palace prefect Baron de Bosset later related the events of that traumatic evening. He heard screams coming from the imperial salon, and was then summoned to find Josephine stretched out on the carpet, moaning and shrieking. He then helped the emperor to carry the prostrate Josephine down to her apartments. She recovered quickly and displayed admirable stoicism. Nothing in her career as empress became her like the leaving of it. For a fortnight she attended a round of official receptions and dinners as if nothing had happened, waiting for the final thunderclap to sound. Once he had taken the irrevocable step, Napoleon's sentimental fondness for Josephine reasserted itself, and he was often to be found by his intimates in tears of regretful expostulation, especially when he learned that Hortense and Eugene were determined to resist the blandishments of the imperial world to follow their mother into internal exile. Once again Napoleon engaged in a favorite fantasy, that of being the victim of circumstance and the plaything of destiny. All his decisions always had to take on the hues of Hegelian necessity. He could never admit that the so-called necessity was simply what he himself had decided. But he tried to soften the blow for Josephine by showering her with rewards and perquisites. He promised her she would keep the title of Empress, her chateau at Malmaison, her jewels and an annual income of 3 million francs in gold, as well as acquiring the honorary title Duchess of Navarre. On the 14th of December came the formal public announcement that the marriage was to be dissolved. In the throne room of the Tuileries, in what was presented as a glittering imperial occasion, Napoleon told his courtiers that he was acting against the dictates of his heart for the best interests of France. After expressing gratitude to Josephine for 13 memorable years, he sat down in tears. Josephine replied by saying she was proud to show this ultimate proof of devotion, but then broke down and could not continue. The rest of her statement was read out by an aide. There were many crocodile tears from those courtiers who loved not Josephine, but the Bonaparte clan were almost publicly exultant. Gloating was the word used by the heartbroken Hortense. There was more emotion to come. Eugene fainted once he had left the throne room, while Josephine burst like a crazy woman into Napoleon's apartments that night, and began kissing him wildly. Sobbing and tears followed, which Napoleon was unable to assuage with a promise that he would always protect her. Disturbed by the emotional hyperbole of the scene, he made sure he was not left alone with her next morning when she and her retinue departed for Malmaison. For all the apparent coldness, he visited her at Malmaison next day and walked hand in hand with her in the garden in pouring rain. For a week he came for similar meetings, taking care never to embrace her or enter the palace. The two continued to correspond, for Napoleon seems genuinely to have been concerned that his ex-wife should adjust as painlessly as possible to her new sphere. Back at Versailles he snapped angrily at the triumphalist Bonaparte sisters, and was gratuitously rude to the new Italian mistress Pauline had procured for him. But soon his thoughts turned to Josephine's successor. His hopes of a marriage to the Russian Grand Duchess Anne were dashed by a less than tactful rebuff from the Tsar, using the excuse that, not yet 16, his sister was too young for marriage. As yet, though, there was no formal repudiation of Napoleon's suit. Balked of the Russian marriage he desired, Napoleon was forced back on his second choice, an Austrian match. Having made his decision, he acted in a quite extraordinary way. He sent Eugene de Beauharnais to the Austrian embassy to ask for the hand of Emperor Francis's 19-year-old daughter Marie-Louise, specifying that the proposal had to be accepted at once, and the contract signed next day. There was to be no time for opinion in Vienna to be consulted. After trying vainly to prevaricate, the ambassador was forced to accept the proposal. Napoleon's tactless bullying was matched only by his equal insensitivity in using Josephine's son as the envoy to find a bride to replace his mother. Once his suit was accepted, Napoleon sent 2 dispatches to the Tsar. In the first he formally withdrew his petition for Alexander's sister's hand. In the other he announced his engagement to Marie-Louise. Much face-saving was involved on both sides, so that a legend later grew up that Napoleon's dispatches crossed in the mails with a formal refusal of the suit from Alexander. The Tsar's snub was actuated by many factors: the intense hatred of his court and the Empress Dowager for Napoleon, the realization that the logic of the continental system would soon put the two nations on a collision course, and even the rumor, said to have been fomented by Josephine, that Napoleon was impotent. But the failed suit has a counterfactual attraction all of its own. Would the Rate RZ campaign still have happened if the emperor had married a Russian princess? Cold reason says yes, for the marriage to Marie-Louise did not prevent a war with Austria. In these marriage negotiations in early Rate Row, Napoleon was at his most gauche, posturing and aggressive. He was scarcely in keen diplomatic form at this juncture, for the marriage to Marie-Louise was a mistake on many different fronts. To the French it seemed like the final abandonment of revolutionary principles, for what could be more blatant than another Austrian marriage, so obviously recalling the hated, doomed and much abused Marie Antoinette. There was even a rumor that all who had voted for the death of Louis XVI and his wife were to be exiled. Meanwhile, Napoleon absurdly thought that a marriage with one of the great ancient regime families would win him acceptance among Europe's crowned heads and the old French oligarchy, so that his ambition of integrating old and new elites in France would be fulfilled. In fact, by casting Josephine aside, he alienated many of the old revolutionaries for whom La Beauharnais was one of us, without conciliating any of the old aristocrats or returned emigrants. Further, many in France gloomily prophesied that Napoleon had put himself into a position where he could not win, since whichever power, Austria or Russia, he failed to yoke himself to dynastically would surely be at war with him within 2 years. He foolishly thought that Austria would have to support him politically from now on, which would force Russia into a league of 3 emperors. Metternich, now foreign minister, advised Emperor Francis to sacrifice his daughter to gain Austria a breathing space, but in a letter to his successor as Austrian ambassador in Paris showed how his mind was really working. We must continue to maneuver, to avoid all military action and to flatter, until the day of deliverance. Castlereagh remarked cynically that it was sometimes necessary to sacrifice a virgin to the Minotaur. This perception of Napoleon as monster was one the young Marie-Louise shared, and how could it have been otherwise when almost from birth she had had vitriolic anti-Bonaparte propaganda dinned into her? But she was a dutiful young woman, in awe of her father, who professed herself willing to make the supreme effort of self-abnegation if it meant saving her country. In personal if not diplomatic terms, Napoleon had made a good choice, for Marie-Louise was not unattractive, even though critics said her face was high-colored and that she looked a little coarse, with her popping eyes and ugly Habsburg lip. In compensation, she was a tall blonde with a good bust and a peach blossom complexion. Moderately intelligent, she painted landscapes and portraits in oil, read a lot and was a talented amateur musician. She played the piano and harp and knew the works of Mozart and Beethoven well. Most pertinently for Napoleon, who regarded her before he met her as a mere walking womb, she was a virgin, never having been left alone with any man. The Austrians were still anxious that Marie-Louise might end up not properly married to Napoleon in the sight of God, for the marriage to Josephine had not been properly annulled. The Pope alone could do that, yet he was not only Napoleon's prisoner, but had excommunicated him. Cardinal Fesch, the fixer in matters religious, was wheeled in to find a solution. He quickly brought up the convenient issue of the absence of a parish priest and legal witnesses at Josephine's wedding, adding the new argument that Napoleon had not given his free consent to the religious marriage, having been bounced into it by Josephine on the eve of his coronation to avoid a national scandal. This convenient fiction was accepted as removing the last obstacle to a full and proper marriage. Lavish preparations were now made in France for the reception of the Austrian princess. Vast sums were spent on the wedding and the total refurbishment of the chateau of Campigny, where Napoleon had chosen to meet his bride. Caroline Murat was sent to Vienna to arrange Marie-Louise's trousseau. This was another inept choice, and not just because the Murats had thrown the Habsburgs out of Naples. Caroline hated to see any other woman getting preferment from her brother, especially one who, by producing an heir, would scotch all the wilder dreams of the Murats of possible future accession to the purple. Not surprisingly, Marie-Louise and Caroline took an intense dislike to one another when they met in Munich. Of the two women, the Austrian was the shrewder, for she saw right through the Bonaparte woman while Caroline grossly underrated her. Marie-Louise was married by proxy in Vienna on II March and commenced her progress to Compiègne, accompanied by Caroline as chaperone. Caroline tried to bully her charge by sending all her entourage and even her dog back to Vienna, but she was discomfited by the daily arrival of letters from her brother to Marie-Louise, full of ripe sentiments of undying affection. In Compiègne, Napoleon was as fretful and impatient as a young bridegroom, counting the days and hours until his beloved's arrival. Once he learned from Fesch that the proxy match in Vienna, with Napoleon represented by the bride's uncle Archduke Karl, was valid, he was determined to consummate the marriage as soon as possible. He did, however, keep on his Italian mistress until the night before he set out to meet his bride. On the night of the 2nd of April, in pelting rain, Napoleon set out to meet the coach which was reported on the road not many miles from Compiègne. After intercepting Marie-Louise and party, he jumped into the coach and embraced her. There was to be no disappointment with a previously unseen bride such as Henry VIII experienced with Anne of Cleves. Once back in the shadow at Compiègne, he brusquely dismissed the crowds of well-wishers, and, after an intimate dinner at which Caroline alone was allowed to be present, he took Marie-Louise to bed. Some would say this was no way to treat a nervous young virgin, and that this behavior once again underlined Napoleon's fundamental misogyny, but Marie-Louise instantly proved to have a natural relish for sex. Napoleon's account of his honeymoon, given on St. Helena, is justly famous. She asked me to do it again. It was perhaps a choice irony for this misogynist to be surrounded by highly sexed women, not just his bevy of mistresses, but his sister Pauline and both his wives. A week later, in a 2-day ceremony on the 2nd of April, the civil and religious marriages took place, the first at St. Cloud, the second at the Tuileries. Tactlessly, Napoleon had decided that his own marriage would follow in exact detail the format of that between Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The principal impression given onlookers at the first ceremony was that the bride was taller than the groom, but the glamour and ostentation of the drive through Paris and the religious ceremony swept aside cavils. Napoleon was dressed in white satin, Marie-Louise in white tulle embroidered with silver. The emperor had once again dragooned his unwilling female connections into service. Walking in front and holding lighted tapers and insignia on tasseled cushions came Caroline Murat, Grand Duchess Stephanie Napoleon of Baden, and the Vicereine Augusta Amelia of Eltali. Holding Marie-Louise's train were the Bonaparte Q, Ians of Spain, Holland and Westphalia, plus Grand Duchess Elissa of Tuscany and Pauline Borghese who, as at the coronation 6 years earlier, complained that the task was beneath her dignity and tried to get out of it on grounds of illness. Throughout Paris, splendid fêtes were given to celebrate the imperial wedding, including one hosted in the garden of his house by Prince Schwarzenberg, the Austrian ambassador. Intent on making a social hit, he had a vast ballroom erected in the garden, but during the ball some gauze draperies caught fire, the flames spread and soon the entire house had gone up in an inferno. Napoleon and Marie-Louise escaped easily enough, but several people perished in the blaze, including the ambassador's brother's wife. The superstitious Napoleon regarded this as a very bad omen, and recalled the fate in R77 at the marriage of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, when 0 people died in the Champs-Élysées. His advisors tried to palliate the portent by alleging that it pointed to Schwarzenberg, not the emperor, and Napoleon took heart from this. After the Battle of Dresden in 1813, it was reported to him that Schwarzenberg had fallen, but he then became gloomy when it transpired that it was his old enemy General Moreau who had been killed. Omens notwithstanding, the marriage initially turned out to be unexpectedly successful. Marie-Louise and Napoleon spent 3 months in honeymoon mode, even as France weathered a severe economic crisis and lost the initiative in Spain. The emperor's apparent lack of interest in his empire was universally remarked. He was often late for council meetings and kept postponing his promised departure for Spain. Indeed, right into raid II, he continued in uxorious and lovesick mood, frequently finding excuses for balls, fêtes, operas and hunts, and happily sitting through long banquets with his new empress at his side. Even the cynical Metternich was forced to report to Emperor Francis that the couple were genuinely in love. Napoleon even seemed to be in awe of his wife, to the point where Marie-Louise confided to Metternich, "I am not afraid of Napoleon, but I am beginning to think he is afraid of me." The only criticism the emperor ever made of her personally was that she was too fond of her food, an attribute he considered unfeminine. Marie-Louise's one drawback as empress was that she was never at ease with the French, possibly because she could not forget that this was the people who had murdered her aunt. She appeared uneasy on public occasions. Her shyness came across as coldness and hauteur. power, especially as she hated small talk and social chit-chat. Josephine had managed to win Parisian hearts, but this was a trick the new empress could never manage. The marriage with Marie-Louise also exacerbated relations with the church, for 13 cardinals refused the urgent imperial summons to attend the wedding. These so-called black cardinals, to distinguish them from the pro-Bonaparte red cardinals, were then disciplined by Fesch, and, when they proved intransigent, thrown into prison. Needing a break from the stresses of office, the emperor decided on a showy imperial progress. On the 27th of April, Napoleon and Marie-Louise departed for a month-long tour of Belgium and northern France, taking in Saint-Quentin, Cambrai, Anvers, Breda, Bergen-op-Zoom, Middelburg, Ghent, Bruges, Ostend, Dunkirk, Boulogne, Dieppe, Le Havre and Rouen. The imperial couple were accompanied by 35 coaches full of princelings and puppet kings. Marie-Louise recorded in her diary the miseries of the long journey, the intrusiveness of protocol, and her husband's irritation if ever she said she was hungry. Back in Paris on the 1st of June, Napoleon decided to pay a visit to Josephine at Malmaison, where she had recently returned after a month's discreet exile at the chateau in Navarre while the marriage with Marie-Louise took place. Relations between Napoleon and his ex-wife remained cordial, and they even continued to correspond, though Marie-Louise would become angry at any mention of Josephine or the emperor's solicitude for her. "How can he want to see that old lady, and a woman of low birth?" was one of her outbursts. At Malmaison, Josephine devoted herself to her menagerie, especially the famed bird collection which contained swans and ostriches. She continued to run up enormous debts which Napoleon guiltily condoned, contrasting them with the austerity and financial prudence of Marie-Louise. 1810 was also the year Napoleon last clapped eyes on Bernadotte, who had still not been court-martialed or disgraced, despite the spectacular incompetence at Auerstadt and Wagram. After the fiasco at Walcheren, Bernadotte, having learned nothing and forgotten nothing, continued to intrigue and was a frequent visitor at the salon of known enemies of the emperor, such as Madame Recamier. But above all, he was a man who proved the truth of the Napoleonic tag "Is he lucky?" In 1810 there was a constitutional crisis in Sweden when Charles XIII died. The Swedes were adamant that they would not accept the return of his nephew Gustav IV, whom they had deposed 2 years earlier, nor would they accept his son, arguing that, in a world where Napoleon was dominant, it made sense to have a Frenchman as their king. They approached Eugene de Beauharnais. He, however, was an ardent Catholic and refused the concomitant demand that he convert to Lutheranism. They then approached Bernadotte, who, gleaming with ambition, came to see Napoleon on the 25th of June for his reaction. So far from acceding, the emperor should have remembered all the Gascon's past treacheries and sent him packing. Yet he lamely gave his consent and even, absurdly, gave him several million francs as a leaving present, so that he could appear in Sweden in suitable splendor. The upshot was that he had a powerful enemy as King of Sweden, commanding considerable military forces. Whatever possessed Napoleon to act with such consummate stupidity? The usual explanation is that, as always with Bernadotte, Napoleon's tender feelings for Désirée got the better of him. If this is true, and it appears to be, the judgment on Napoleon as misogynist should be tempered by a realization of the sentimental side of his attitude to women. Naturally, though, we should not forget that there were deep psychological drives behind his peculiar, complacent attitude to both Josephine and Désirée. There is no need to labor the contrast between Eugene de Beauharnais, always upright, loyal and a man of moral principle, and Bernadotte, who could switch religions and political principles like a change of clothes when it suited him. The new King Charles XIV of Sweden was the ex-Jacobin who had once had death to all kings tattooed on his arm. When Bernadotte later, predictably, proved treacherous as King of Sweden, Napoleon reflected ruefully that there were 3 occasions when he should have had Bernadotte shot and spared him each time because of Désirée. His own explanation for letting this ingrate have a throne was as follows: "I was seduced by the glory of seeing a Marshal of France become a king, a woman in whom I was interested as queen, and my godson, a Prince Royal." Yet Bernadotte was only the most spectacular disappointment of the nest of incompetents and schemers who formed the inner circle of Bonaparte's extended family. Lucien continued to resist all pressure to give up his wife and finally decided to make a new life in the USA. He and his family had barely left France than they were captured by a British warship and taken to England. There the ruling elite made a point of lionizing him, for sheer propaganda advantage. What more signal proof of Bonaparte's tyranny could there be than that his own brother had fled from it? Lucien remained under very comfortable house arrest until 1814 at Ludlow and Thorngrove in Worcestershire. In terms of their own propaganda, this was of course sheer illogicality on the part of the British elite. Had they really thought Lucien was a refugee from egregious tyranny, they would surely have turned him loose to make trouble in Europe. Louis Bonaparte's public career came to a humiliating close when Napoleon annexed Holland and forced him to abdicate the throne, while leaving him his income and honorary title. This was the chance Hortense de Beauharnais was looking for. Deprived of the title of queen, she no longer saw the need to put up with her sexually peculiar husband. In the late summer of 1810 she joined her mother on a leisurely trip in Savoy and took the Comte de Flahoudt as a lover. In Westphalia the useless Jerome felt himself to be on shifting sands, but was uncertain whether the blow that would displace him would come from his brother or his subjects. There could be no doubting his unpopularity, since his kingdom was bowed down by taxation and united in loathing of the decadent court, the reckless rakes, libertines and adventuresses that swarmed there, and the Corsican playboy who had been set over them as monarch. Jerome kept 3 horses permanently saddled and waiting in the courtyard, with 3 spares, in case he needed to flee his kingdom in a hurry. Meanwhile he continued his profligate opera bouffe career. After one of his carouses he was so drunk that he was arrested in the street by his own police, who did not recognize him. Napoleon could afford to treat his brothers with contempt, but the Murats were a more dangerous proposition. After Louis's downfall, Murat suspected that he was next on the emperor's hit list, so opted for offense as the best form of defense. His minister Maghella advised that the card to play was to pose as the champion of Italian unity, and to form a party which would back him if the French tried to dispossess him. While making secret contacts with anti-Bonaparte Italian nationalists, Murat tried to make his French officials put their loyalty to him and Naples above their oaths to France and the emperor, and floated a scheme to make them all take out Neapolitan naturalization papers. The ingenious Napoleon stymied that by decreeing that every French citizen was also a citizen of Naples by virtue of that city's being part of the French Empire. The noses of the scheming, unscrupulous Bonaparte clan were put out of joint by the news, in autumn 1810, that Marie-Louise was pregnant, and heir to Napoleon would end all their vague hopes of inheriting the wealth and power of empire. But the birth of Napoleon's son, on the 20th of March 181, was a close-run thing. As was usual in those days, a royal birth was a public event, with extended family, courtiers and ambassadors all present in the bedroom. Marie-Louise experienced a difficult and protracted labor, and her cries of pain caused Napoleon deep distress. The obstetrician told him that it would be a difficult breech birth, and that both mother and child were in danger. It might be that he could save the mother only by killing the baby or vice versa, since the birth of an heir was the very point of the marriage with Marie-Louise, which was it to be. Without hesitation Napoleon replied, "Save the mother." Marie-Louise's final agony lasted 20 minutes before a successful forceps delivery. The man who could look on scenes of battlefield slaughter unblinkingly could not take the blood and pain of childbirth, and retreated to the bathroom near the end. When the child was born, it appeared to be stillborn and lay for 7 minutes without signs of life. Napoleon looked at his son, for such it was, and was convinced he was dead. Suddenly the infant let out a lusty cry. Once the doctor assured him that the boy would live, Napoleon took him in his arms. Soon the cannon roared with the prearranged signal for the birth, 21 rounds for a girl, 100 for a boy. At the 22nd booming, the Parisian crowd went wild. Napoleon watched scenes of spectacular public drunkenness with tears running down his cheeks. Napoleon's son was given the title the King of Rome. At the age of 3 months, on the 9th of June he was solemnly baptized in Notre Dame. But immediately after the birth, observers noted a change in the emperor's attitude to Marie-Louise. Whether it was because his cynicism reasserted itself once the walking womb had fulfilled its biological function, or whether the gory scenes of childbirth had killed his appetite for his wife, he immediately seemed to resume the old pattern that had marked his life with Josephine. After a 2-week tour of Normandy between the 22nd of May and the 5th of June, he took his meals alone and spent most of the day in his office. He even resumed his liaisons with other women, and brought Marie Walska and her son to Paris for another round of their on-off affair. Marie-Louise began to grow disillusioned with her situation, especially since the Bonaparte set now loathed her more vehemently than they had loathed Josephine. She displayed an increasing tendency to withdraw into seclusion, confiding only in her lady-in-waiting Madame de Montebello. This woman was yet another in the long list of vipers Napoleon unwittingly clasped to his bosom, for the 29-year-old Louise, Madame de Montebello, was something of a female Bernadotte in her hatred for the emperor, a Breton Jacobin of virulent anti-Bonaparte persuasion. She gradually poisoned Marie-Louise's mind against her husband. Napoleon could therefore not look for much even in his own immediate family. Much more worrying in the long term was that in the social alliance between emperor and bourgeoisie and between Napoleon and the notables began to break down. Superficially, this was because he appeared ever more despotic and demanding and thus alienated his power base. This was not a totally negligible factor, but this sort of analysis should be applied with care. The usual charge against Napoleon is that he introduced the first police state, and it is true that the heavy-handed methods of Savary, the new chief of police, seriously enraged the bourgeoisie. Savary, a notorious bull in a china shop, finally replaced Fouch in I-8IO after the sinister spymaster indulged in one intrigue too many. He sent a peace mission to England which proposed that the British abandon Spain in return for French help in reconquering the USA. Since these quixotic proposals were made without the emperor's knowledge and consent, he had no realistic option but to dismiss Fouch. Theorists of Napoleon as despot need to explain why he always took an unconscionable time to break with those who notably betrayed him. Relations with Bernadotte, Fouch, Talleyrand and Murat all follow the same pattern. But on the broader count of the indictment of introducing a police state, there is much to be said in Napoleon's favor. There had been 60,000 people in jail under the Directory, but Napoleon boasted that at his peak there were just 243 prisoners in 6 state prisons. After all the chaos of the revolution, and given the population of France, this was a staggering figure. There was nothing of the modern dictator about Napoleon's treatment of prisoners. Most of the 9,000 imprisoned at the time of 18 Brumaire had been released, and the only political prisoners were either Chouans reprieved from the death penalty, British spies, royalists who had returned illegally, or emigrants who had violated the terms of the general amnesty by plotting and had then been caught by police surveillance. Apart from a handful of priests jailed after Napoleon's clash with the Pope, most of the prisoners in the cells were hardened criminals associated with organized crime, whom Napoleon had indeed arbitrarily, but some would say justifiably, detained when local juries were too fearful of reprisals to convict. Moreover, the police under Napoleon had no power to detain arbitrarily, in contrast to the situation in a totalitarian regime proper, while imperial attorneys had the power to release anyone imprisoned provided he was not jailed by a decision of the Privy Council. Although it would be absurd to claim that the imperial police and industrial conciliation boards were partial to labor, they did provide an appearance of fairness, and made the point that employers were not the final court of appeal. Nor was the bourgeoisie particularly upset by other manifestations of Bonapartist dictatorship. His attempt to tighten his grip on national education by decreeing in 18II that Catholic schools, hitherto independent, should be under the authority of Louis de Fontaines and the Imperial University, achieved little success. Bishops frequently bypassed it with the collusion of Fontaines and his inspectors. The surprising thing about Napoleon's rift with the Pope and his apparently tough anti-Catholic stance was how little it changed. Napoleonic education was largely a process of inculcating the religious practices and pious observances he himself had learned under the ancient regime. The effect of the papal excommunication was negligible. It was notable that after this French bishops were still able to offer a Te Deum for the peace treaty with Austria in 1809 and for a valid religious marriage ceremony to be conducted for the emperor and Marie-Louise. Perhaps more irritation was caused by the confiscation of all independent Parisian newspapers in I-8II. Henceforth entirely in government hands, they became insipid and dull. Some said Napoleon was concerned at the poor image of his empire presented by the independent newspapers, and their scandal stories which pointed up the vulgar ostentation of the regime and even its quasi-gangsterism. Metternich's simultaneous affair with Caroline Murat and Laura Junot was the best known of these scandals, for when the jealous Caroline tipped off Junot about his wife's infidelity, and Junot found the incriminating evidence Caroline had guided him to, he attacked his wife with scissors, leaving her half dead, tried to challenge Metternich to a duel and insisted that the emperor declare war on Austria. Readers of the scandal sheets particularly enjoyed the alleged riposte by Madame Metternich, when Junot peached to her, "The role of Othello ill becomes you." The notables acknowledged, too, that Napoleon had not threatened their privileges with carrière ouvert aux talents meritocracy. The new administrative elite came from their ranks, sons and in-laws of ministers, senators, councillors of state, generals and prefects, provided they had an annual income of 6,000 francs, were the only ones eligible as auditors to the Council of State, as judges or as tax collectors, and the only ones who could afford the ill-paid posts anyway. The elitist nature of Napoleon's regime was also evinced by the army, where nepotism and a caste mentality prevailed, and by the creation in R808 of the Imperial University, and the Grandes Écoles which established that the only route to a decent education was through parental wealth. The administrative elite, in a word, was the preserve of the old aristocracy, or the new plutocracy who had benefited from the spoils of the revolution. Surprising numbers of landed proprietors had weathered the storms of 1789-94 to emerge as major real estate owners under the empire. Meanwhile, the sale of national property had virtually dried up, and the only entrepreneurial opportunity, apart from looting, was speculation in colonial products. The reality of negligible social mobility was obfuscated and mystified in Napoleonic propaganda by constant emphasis on the careers of the handful, like Murat, who had made their way from the gutter to the top. The traditional view is that the peasantry escaped their soil bondage under Napoleon by military service, but this is largely a myth. It was just possible, but only just, for the average peasant to better himself by joining the army and rising through the ranks. Every soldier may in theory have carried a marshal's baton in his knapsack, But the reality was that few peasants, however talented, could hope to progress beyond the rank of lieutenant. The most that could be hoped for was the salary attached to the Legion d'Honneur. As for loot from the conquest of Europe, again the reality was that only the already privileged really benefited, with gratuities and benefices for generals, highly placed officials and nobles, or commercial profits for manufacturers and traders. If France under Napoleon seemed at first blush like a paradise for the notables, why then were they so disenchanted with the regime by I-8IOII? They disliked his foreign adventurism and would have been content with the natural frontiers. They were suspicious of the creation of the new noblesse empire and the Austrian marriage, both of which seemed to indicate a fondness for the old aristocracy, and they could see no point in the war in Spain, which simply looked like a crude attempt to seize a crown for Joseph. But they could no doubt have found a way to cohabit with all this, had it not been for the severe economic depression of I-8IOII, which was itself a consequence of the emperor's continental blockade. The real sticking point for the notables, then, was the continental system. Napoleon's economic warfare against Britain began in earnest with the Berlin Decree of 2 November I-806, immediately after his victory at Jena. Although the expression continental blockade was first used in Le Moniteur on the 30th of October I-806, the idea did not originate with Bonaparte, but was one of many he inherited from the Revolution, since the convention in I-793 announced the exclusion of British goods. According to Miet de Melito, in a speech on May I-803, the first consul vowed he would make the British weep for the coming war, and tried to close Channel ports as far as Hanover to British commerce. Yet in the aftermath of Trafalgar it seemed as though the boot was on the other foot.